Every Christmas Eve, my mother set the table for 8 people and I was not one of them. Not because there wasn't enough room. Our dining room had a table that could seat 10 comfortably. My mother had bought it specifically because she liked hosting big holiday dinners. There were chairs to spare. There was always enough food. The problem was never space. The problem was me. The first time it happened, I was 22. I had just driven 4 hours from Columbus back to my hometown in western Pennsylvania. The whole drive through freezing rain, wipers working overtime, car heater blowing lukewarm air at best. I pulled into my parents' driveway at 6:15 in the evening with a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel on the passenger seat, still warm from the oven. I had made my grandmother's green bean casserole from scratch. Not the canned soup version, the real one, with caramelized onions and homemade bechamel. My mother met me at the door. She was wearing her good blouse, the burgundy one she only brought out for company. She looked me up and down the way she always did, taking inventory of everything she found lacking, and then she said, very casually, the way you might say, the weather looks like rain. "Oh good, you're here. Listen, your brother's girlfriend is coming and we need her seat to feel special. You won't mind eating at the little table in the sunroom, will you?" The sunroom. In December. In Pennsylvania. I stood there holding my casserole dish, and I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. My brother's girlfriend, Tanya, was 20 years old and had been dating my brother for approximately 6 weeks. I was the daughter who had lived in this house for 18 years. I was the one who had learned to cook from my grandmother in that kitchen. I was the one who had driven through freezing rain with homemade food. And I was the one being moved to the sunroom. I told myself it was a one-time thing. Tanya was new. My mother was trying to make her comfortable. It was a kind impulse even if the execution was thoughtless. I carried my casserole dish to the sunroom and ate Christmas Eve dinner alone at a folding table with a space heater that clicked and smelled faintly of burning dust. Tanya and my brother broke up in February. The next Christmas Eve, there was someone else at my seat. Over the years, it was different people and different reasons. My brother brought home a college roommate whose family was in Florida. My mother's book club friend was going through a divorce and needed cheering up. My cousin visited from Seattle, and of course she needed the good chair, the one near the window, the one that was closest to the kitchen, so you could be part of the conversation. There was always a reason, and the reason was always more important than me. I want to be clear about something, because I know what people think when they hear a story like this. They think, why didn't you just say something? Why didn't you refuse? Why did you keep going back? I've asked myself those questions 1,000 times. The honest answer is complicated, and it has to do with the fact that my father left when I was 9, and after he left it was just me and my mother and my brother in that house, and I spent the next decade trying to be the kind of daughter who didn't cause problems. My mother had enough problems. She worked double shifts at the hospital. She came home exhausted. She cried sometimes in her room thinking I couldn't hear her. I learned early that the way to keep peace in that house was to be easy. Be low maintenance. Don't need too much. Don't take up too much space. That's a hard lesson to unlearn. Even when you're 28 and living in your own apartment and paying your own bills, you still hear your mother's voice in your head telling you not to make things difficult. And there was something else too. My grandmother, she lived 40 minutes away in a farmhouse outside of Greensburg, and she came to Christmas Eve dinner every year without fail. She was the reason I kept driving back through the snow. She was the reason I kept making her green bean casserole and bringing it with me like an offering. Sitting in the sunroom or the hallway or wherever my mother had decided to put me that year, my grandmother would always find a way to slip away from the main table and come sit with me for a while. She'd bring her wine and her plate, and she'd sit across from me at whatever folding table or TV tray I'd been assigned, and she'd say, "I like it better over here anyway, it's quieter." She never said anything directly about what my mother did. That wasn't her way. But she always found me, wherever I'd been put, and she sat with me, and that meant everything. My grandmother's name was Margaret Elaine Sutherland. She was 79 years old, sharp as a tack, and she had spent her whole life accumulating things quietly. Not just money, but property, the farmhouse, 40 acres of land that had been in the family for 3 generations, a portfolio of investments she'd built herself after my grandfather died, a savings account she referred to only as the rainy day fund. She never talked about money. She bought her clothes at Goodwill and drove a 2009 Subaru and made her own jam. You would not have known, looking at her, that she had anything at all. She died in March, on a Thursday, quietly in her sleep, and I found out from a phone call from my mother at 7 in the morning. I sat on my kitchen floor in Columbus and cried until I had nothing left. The funeral was the following Monday. I drove home. My mother was already in full organizational mode. The funeral home, the flowers, the reception, the obituary. She moved through the house with a clipboard and a focused expression that I recognized as her way of not feeling things. My brother was there too, quieter than usual, doing whatever my mother asked. I didn't ask about the will. I wasn't thinking about the will. I was thinking about my grandmother's hands, the way they smelled like lavender dish soap, the way she'd squeeze my hand when she sat down next to me at whatever side table I'd been assigned, the way she'd said to me the last Christmas, just 2 months earlier, "You're going to be fine, Iris. You've always been the one I didn't worry about." I hadn't known what she meant by that then. It was about 6 weeks after the funeral that I started to wonder. My grandmother had mentioned the farmhouse to me once, specifically about a year before she died. We were sitting on her porch in August, shelling butterbeans, and she said out of nowhere, "This land ought to stay in the family. Someone who'd take care of it." I hadn't thought much about it at the time. It seemed like the kind of thing old people said, but 6 weeks after she died, when I asked my mother if there was any update on the estate, my mother said it was being handled and changed the subject. 2 weeks later, I asked again. My mother said the estate was more complicated than expected, and the lawyer was working through it. I am a paralegal. I have been a paralegal for 4 years. I know exactly how long estate administration takes in Pennsylvania, and I know when someone is stalling. I called the probate court in Westmoreland County and asked if a will had been filed for Margaret Elaine Sutherland. There was a pause on the phone, and then the clerk said, "Yes, a will was submitted for probate last month." Last month. 4 weeks after the funeral. My mother had filed the will for probate without telling me. The clerk couldn't give me the details over the phone, but wills in Pennsylvania are public record once filed. I drove home the following Saturday and went to the courthouse. I sat in a plastic chair in the probate court clerk's office and read my grandmother's will. It was 4 pages. Clear, precise, notarized correctly, witnessed by 2 people, dated 14 months before she died. My grandmother had written it herself with a lawyer, and she had known exactly what she was doing. The farmhouse and the 40 acres went to me. The savings account, the rainy day fund, which turned out to be $340,000, went to me. Her car, her jewelry, her personal effects, all to me, with specific language, to my granddaughter Iris, who has always shown up. My mother was left her mother's china set and a letter. I sat in that plastic chair for a long time. I called an estate attorney that same afternoon. His name was Mr. Pernett, Galveston, and he had an office downtown, and he picked up on the second ring. I explained the situation. He said what I'd already suspected. My mother had received a copy of the will at the same time as the court filing, which meant she had known for at least 4 weeks that I was the primary beneficiary. She had said nothing to me. He also pointed out something I hadn't caught. The personal representative named in the will, the person responsible for administering the estate, was not my mother. It was my grandmother's friend and neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Tran, who had known my grandmother for 30 years. My grandmother had planned that too. She had not trusted my mother to handle it fairly. I drove back to my parents' house that afternoon. My mother was in the kitchen making coffee. My brother was watching football in the other room. I sat down at the kitchen table, the main kitchen table, the one I was never allowed to eat at during holidays, and I put a copy of the will on the table between us. My mother looked at it. She looked at me. "Mom," I said, "I need you to explain why you didn't tell me." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I was trying to figure out how to talk to you about it." For 4 weeks. It's complicated, Iris. It's really not, I said. She left it to me. You knew. You didn't tell me. That's not complicated. That's a choice you made. My mother's face did something complicated then. She looked for a moment like she was going to cry. And then she looked like she was going to be angry. And then she landed somewhere in between, which was a kind of cold, deflecting calm that I knew well. Your grandmother always favored you, she said. She never treated your brother and me fairly. This is just more of the same. I thought about saying a lot of things. I thought about bringing up the sunroom, the folding tables, the space heaters, the 8 Christmases I had spent eating alone while someone else sat in my chair. I thought about the 4-hour drives, the casserole dishes, the times I had bitten my tongue and told myself it was fine, it was fine, it was fine, it was fine. I didn't say any of that. I just stood up, picked up the copy of the will and said, I'm going to work with Mrs. Tran to get the estate settled. I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere. Then I walked out of the kitchen and drove back to Columbus. Mr. Galveston helped me understand my rights and connected me with Mrs. Tran, who was warm and efficient and had clearly been expecting something like this. The estate settled without any legal challenge. My mother hired an attorney briefly, but the will was ironclad. My grandmother had made sure of that. 14 months of making sure. I took possession of the farmhouse in June. The first time I walked through it alone without anyone else there, I stood in my grandmother's kitchen for a long time. The butterbean shells were gone. The porch swing was still there. Her jam jars were still lined up on the windowsill, catching the afternoon light, amber and red. I opened the cabinet above the stove, and her handwriting was on a sticky note on the inside of the door, Rosemary in the garden, still coming back. Don't let it go to seed. I sat down on her porch and I cried again, but differently this time. Not the gutted kind of crying from March, something else. I decided I was going to host Christmas Eve. I told my brother first, in October, over the phone. I told him I was hosting at the farmhouse, that he was welcome to come, that I would be making grandmother's green bean casserole and a few other things, and that I wanted it to feel like her house had always felt. He was quiet for a second and then he said, Yeah, I'll be there. I sent my mother a text, not an invitation exactly. More of a statement of fact. I'm hosting Christmas Eve at the farmhouse this year. You're welcome to come if you'd like to. She didn't respond for 2 days. When she did, she said she'd think about it. In November, I started getting the house ready. I cleaned out the spare rooms and aired them, fixed a fence post that had been leaning since August, turned over the garden beds, brought in firewood from the pile my grandmother had stacked the previous spring. I ordered a dining table, a real one. Oval, seats 8. I had a friend help me move my grandmother's hutch to make room for it. I sent invitations to a few people I actually wanted there. My college roommate Simone, who was the kind of person who shows up with good wine and stays to help wash dishes. My friend Kenji from work, who had nowhere to go for the holidays that year. 2 neighbors from my grandmother's road who had known her for decades, and who I'd met at the funeral and who seemed like they deserved a Christmas Eve. And Mrs. Tran, who said yes immediately. 6 chairs at the table, 4 guests plus my brother, and 1 empty chair. I didn't plan the empty chair as a statement, I just knew I wasn't going to fill it. Some things don't need explaining. My mother did not come. She texted me on the afternoon of Christmas Eve to say she wasn't feeling well. I read the text, put my phone in my pocket, and went back to the kitchen. The dinner was, I think, the best I've ever cooked. The green bean casserole was perfect. Simone brought a cranberry and orange salad that everyone asked for the recipe. Kenji brought a pie that he admitted he'd bought from a bakery, and it was delicious. Mrs. Tran arrived with a bottle of wine and a card that she handed to me privately, and I didn't open it until later that night when everyone had gone home. Inside was a note in my grandmother's handwriting, dated the previous January, folded inside a card Mrs. Tran had chosen. My grandmother had given it to her to keep, to deliver at the right time. It said, I know what goes on at Christmas. I've always known. I just didn't know how to fix it while I was here. I hope this helps. The land is yours because you are the one who stayed, not in a house. I know you left, and that was right. But you stayed yourself. That's harder. I'm proud of you, Iris. Save some of the land for a garden. The rosemary will keep coming back if you let it. I sat at the dining table in my grandmother's farmhouse, in the chair at the head of the table, and I read that note 3 times. There was one empty chair across from me. I didn't feel the need to fill it. Some things your family gives you and some things they withhold. And sometimes what they withhold turns out to be the thing that teaches you who you actually are. I spent 8 years making myself smaller at my mother's table because I had learned early that being easy was the price of belonging. I drove through ice and snow and freezing rain, carrying casserole dishes like I was trying to prove I deserved a seat. I didn't need to prove anything. My grandmother knew that before I did. The rosemary came back that spring, exactly like she said it would. I didn't let it go to seed. I cut it back and used it in everything. Roasted chicken, focaccia, a simple potato soup I made one Sunday in February when it snowed and I didn't want to go anywhere at all. I sat at the kitchen table with my soup and my grandmother's handwriting on the inside of the cabinet door and the afternoon light coming through the window and hitting the last of her jam jars, and I thought, this is what belonging feels like. Not being allowed somewhere, just being somewhere and knowing it's yours. If you're watching this and you've spent years making yourself small at someone else's table, I see you. You don't have to earn your seat. Find out whose table it actually is. Sometimes it's been yours all along. And drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been made to feel like a guest in your own family? I read every single one. I think about cause and effect a lot more than I used to, not in a dramatic way. Just in the quiet, practical way that comes from sitting with something long enough to actually see it clearly. What you do accumulates. What you choose, year after year, even when the choice feels small, or forced, or like it doesn't matter. It adds up into something. A record. A pattern. A life. My mother made a choice every Christmas Eve for 8 years. She chose who sat at the main table and who got moved. She chose every single time that my comfort was less important than someone else's impression. She didn't think of it as a choice, I'm sure. She thought of it as logistics, hospitality, keeping the peace. But her daughter noticed. And her mother noticed too. My grandmother Margaret never said a word to me directly about what went on at those dinners. That used to frustrate me when I was younger. I wanted her to say something, to intervene, to tell my mother to stop. But I understand now why she didn't. She couldn't fix my mother. She had spent decades knowing exactly who her daughter was, and she had made her peace with that. What she could do was something quieter and more lasting. She could make sure that the person who showed up anyway, who drove through ice storms with homemade casseroles, who sat alone in a cold room and still came back the following year. She could make sure that person was taken care of. That's not luck. That's not inheritance in the lucky lottery sense. That's cause and effect working the way it's supposed to, slowly, over decades, in ways you can't see until you're sitting in a probate court, reading 4 pages that change everything. There's something I want to say about intelligence here, because I don't mean the test score kind, I mean the kind of intelligence that pays attention. My grandmother was one of the most quietly intelligent people I've ever known. She watched, she remembered, she noticed who brought food they'd made themselves and who showed up empty-handed. She noticed who sat with her when no one was watching, and who only sought her out when there was something to gain. That kind of intelligence, the observational kind, the patient kind, is a skill. You can build it. It means caring enough about the truth to actually look at it instead of at the story you'd prefer. And the courage part. Because I want to be honest. Walking into my mother's kitchen and putting that will on the table between us took everything I had. 8 years of practicing smallness doesn't evaporate overnight. I sat down at that kitchen table, the one I'd never been allowed to eat at on holidays, and my hands were steady, but my chest was not. What I'd practiced for 8 years was accommodation. What I did that afternoon was the opposite. That's how character works, I think. Not in the big dramatic moments alone, but in the 100 small ones before it. Every time you tell the truth when a lie would be easier. Every time you tell the truth when a lie would be easier. Every time you don't pretend something is fine when it isn't. Every time you stay yourself, even inside a situation designed to make you smaller, you are building something. My grandmother called it staying yourself. She said it was harder than staying in a place. She was right. The farmhouse is mine now. The rosemary came back. I didn't let it go to seed.